The silence in the cathedral was a living thing. Heavy, cold, and tasting of dust. Seraphina Vale kept her eyes fixed on Adrian's face, searching for the man who had promised her a lifetime of protection. But Adrian wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, toward the massive oak doors where a woman in scarlet silk stood, her hand resting over a deliberate, unmistakable swell of her stomach. "I can't," Adrian's voice cracked, loud enough for the hundreds of witnesses to hear. "She is my soulmate, Seraphina. She carries my air. I won't spend my life bound to a shadow of a woman just to satisfy a treaty." He turned his back on her before she could even draw a breath to protest. The cathedral erupted. Hushed whispers like the sound of 1,000 snakes. Seraphina felt the heat climb her neck, the weight of her ivory lace gown suddenly feeling like a shroud. She stood alone at the altar, a princess turned into a punchline in less than 60 seconds. The tears hadn't even begun to fall when the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sound but a pressure. A dark, magnetic force that made the whispers die in throats and the air grow thin. From the front row a figure rose. He didn't walk, he prowled. His black ceremonial suit, stitched with gold, caught the light like armor. Adrian's superior, the man who held the fate of both their kingdoms in his scarred hands, stepped onto the altar. The crowd held its breath. Adrian froze, his eyes widening in terror as the king he served approached his abandoned bride. Lucien didn't look at Adrian. He looked only at Seraphina. His hand, large and calloused, reached out and gripped hers, not with a gentle touch, but with a possessive iron certainty. The heat of him burned through her glove. He leaned in, his scent of cedar and rain overwhelming her senses, and spoke 5 words that changed the world. "Finish the wedding. With me." The silence in the Cathedral of Valoria was no longer a vacuum. It was a physical weight, pressing the air from Seraphina's lungs. She stood frozen, her ivory lace gown, once a symbol of a bright diplomatic future, now feeling like a shroud of public humiliation. 10 feet away, Adrian Blackmore had already moved. He wasn't just leaving. He was gravitating toward the back of the church where the woman in scarlet stood. The mistress, Elena, didn't look like a villain. She looked like a woman who had one. Her hand remained protectively over the small swell of her stomach, a silent, devastating testament to Adrian's true priorities. "I am sorry, Seraphina," Adrian called back, his voice echoing against the vaulted stone. "But a man cannot be expected to choose duty over his own blood. My soul belongs with her." The scandalized gasps of 500 nobles rose like a swarm of hornets. Seraphina's father, the Duke of Vale, surged forward in the front pew, his face a mask of purple fury, but the political damage was already done. The alliance was a shattered glass at her feet. Seraphina felt the first hot, stinging tear track down her cheek. She waited for the world to end. She waited for the doors to close on her life. Instead, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy with a dark, predatory magnetism. The shuffling of the crowd ceased instantly as a shadow detached itself from the front row. Lucien Draven, the Alpha King, rose with a lethargic, dangerous grace. He was Adrian's sovereign, the man whose scowl could end a trade route and whose favor could build an empire. He didn't look at the fleeing groom. He didn't acknowledge the mistress. His gaze was a laser, locked entirely on Seraphina's trembling form. Every step he took toward the altar was a rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate in her very marrow. As he stepped onto the dais, the priest stumbled back, clutching his gold-leafed book. Lucien was a head taller than Adrian, broader, his presence consuming the light of the flickering candles. He reached out, his gloved hand closing around Seraphina's wrist with a grip that was less of a comfort and more of a claim. The heat of him was staggering. "Your Majesty," Seraphina whispered, her voice a fractured thread. "You shouldn't." "Quiet, Seraphina," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that only she could hear. He turned his head slightly, his sharp, aristocratic profile silhouetted against the stained glass. He looked at the priest, then at the stunned congregation, his eyes glowing with an amber intensity that demanded absolute submission. "The wedding is not over," Lucien announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral like a thunderclap. "The Blackmores have proven they cannot hold what is precious. I, however, have no such weakness." He looked back at Seraphina, his thumb brushing over her pulse point, feeling the frantic rabbit thump of her heart. "Proceed," Lucien commanded the priest. "Finish the ceremony. With me." The transition from the cathedral to the Black Palace was a blur of velvet curtains and the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves. Seraphina sat in the royal carriage, the weight of a crown she hadn't earned pressing into her temples. Beside her, Lucien was a silent, looming presence. He didn't speak, but his scent, crushed peppercorn in winter rain, filled the small space, staking a claim on the very air she breathed. When the carriage door opened, the Black Palace rose before them like a jagged tooth of obsidian against the moonlight. This was the heart of the Draven lineage, a place of ancient power and predatory grace. As Lucien led her through the towering arched entryway, the servants bowed so low their forehead nearly touched the stone. "The Queen's suite has been prepared," Lucien announced, his voice echoing off the marble. He didn't release her hand until they reached the heavy oak doors of the master wing. Inside, the room was a masterpiece of dark silk and flickering firelight. Seraphina turned to him, her fingers trembling as she clutched the lace of her skirt. "Why, Lucien? You could have had anyone. Why humiliate yourself by taking my brother's leavings?" Lucien stepped into the light of the hearth, the amber in his eyes catching the flame. The predatory mask he wore for the court didn't slip, but it softened at the edges. "I am never humiliated, Seraphina. And you are no one's leavings." He moved closer, his shadow stretching across the floor until it swallowed hers. "We need to establish the parameters of this arrangement. To the world, we are a miracle. A fated match that sparked the moment Adrian proved his unworthiness. When we are in public, you will look at me as if I am the sun. You will touch me. You will let me hold you as if I might devour anyone who dares to look at you." Seraphina's breath hitched. "And when the doors are closed," Lucien reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that felt more dangerous than his anger. "In private, you are a guest. My chambers are across the hall. You will have your own space, your own life, and my absolute protection. You are safe here, Seraphina. From Adrian, from the gossip, and from me." He pulled back, the sudden absence of his heat leaving her cold. "I have no interest in a forced bed. I want a queen who stands beside me because she chooses to, not because she was rescued. And if I can't be that for you?" she whispered. Lucien paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He didn't look back, but his voice was like iron. "Then we play our parts until the alliance is secure. But remember this. In this palace, my word is law. And my word is that no harm will ever reach you again." The click of the door closing felt like the start of a new life, one where she was no longer a victim, but a captive of a king whose mercy felt suspiciously like an obsession. The grand hall of the Black Palace was a sea of shimmering silk and predatory whispers. Gold candelabras cast flickering shadows against the obsidian walls. And for the first time, Seraphina felt the suffocating weight of the Draven crown. Every eye in the room followed her, searching for a crack in the porcelain mask of the new queen. Beside her, Lucien was a silent mountain of dark authority. He didn't speak to the minor lords who approached, merely offering a curt nod that sent them scurrying away. His hand remained anchored at the small of her back, the heat of his palm seeping through the thin silk of her gown like a brand. It was the performance they had agreed upon, yet the way his fingers splayed possessively against her spine felt disturbingly real. "I need a moment," Seraphina murmured, her senses overwhelmed by the scent of heavy lilies and Lucien's own intoxicating aroma of rain and cedar. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Do not wander far, my queen. The wolves are hungry tonight." She stepped away, seeking the shadows of a stone pillar near the balcony. But the peace was short-lived. A familiar scent, expensive cologne and stagnant regret, filled the air. "Seraphina." She stiffened. Adrian stood there looking haggard, his formal doublet unlaced at the throat. He reached out as if to touch her arm, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic sort of longing. "I made a mistake. Elena. The pregnancy. It's complicated. But seeing you with him, seeing you in his colors, it's wrong. You were mine first. You threw me away, Adrian," Seraphina said, her voice shaking with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. "In front of God and the king. I was pressured. We can fix this, we can." Adrian's words died in a choked gasp. Before Seraphina could blink, the air in the alcove turned freezing. Lucien was there. moving with a speed that defied his massive frame. He didn't strike Adrian. He simply stepped into the man's space, his hand snapping out to grip Adrian's throat with terrifying precision. The sound of Adrian's heels scraping the marble was the only noise in the sudden vacuum of the hall. Lucien leaned in, his face inches from Adrian's, his eyes glowing a lethal, predatory amber. "You speak her name again," Lucien rumbled, a sound that started deep in his chest and vibrated through the floorboards, "and I will tear the tongue from your mouth. She is not yours. She is the queen of this realm. She is mine." Lucien released him and Adrian collapsed, gasping for air. Without a second glance at the broken man, Lucien turned to Seraphina. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply reached out, his hand cupping her nape, his thumb pressing firmly into the sensitive skin behind her ear. It was a claim, a mark, a public declaration of ownership that left her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The dance is starting," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive silk, "and I don't intend to share." As he led her toward the floor, Seraphina realized with a jolt of terror that she wasn't repelled by his violence. She was breathless, her skin tingling where he touched her, her soul reeling from the realization that she wanted the king to mark her again. The nausea arrived with the sunrise, a cold, rolling wave that sent Seraphina staggering toward the porcelain basin. It wasn't the stress of the Black Palace or the lingering phantom of Adrian's touch that turned her stomach. It was the heavy rhythmic thrum of a new life, one that had begun in a moment of misguided hope before the altar had become a crime scene. She sat on the cold marble floor of her bathroom, her hand trembling as she pressed it against her still flat stomach. 6 weeks. The timing was a jagged blade. This was Adrian's child, a living tether to the man who had traded her for a mistress. Fear, cold and paralyzing, seeped into her bones. Lucien Draven was an alpha king, whose lineage was defined by purity and power. He had claimed her to salvage an alliance and satisfy a sudden, dark whim, but he would not suffer a rival's seat on his throne. She pictured the annulment papers, the quiet exile, and the public shame that would finally break her father's heart. She avoided Lucien for 3 days, haunting the library and the shadowed corridors like a ghost. But at the midwinter reception, there was nowhere to hide. The court was a shark tank of perfumed predatory intent, and she was the blood in the water. Lucien found her near the musician's dais. He looked lethal in charcoal silk, his presence an anchored weight in the shifting crowd. He didn't ask why she had been absent. He simply leaned down, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. Seraphina's breath hitched. Shifters knew. They knew the scent of change, the subtle shift in hormones that preceded the swell of a belly. She waited for his hand to drop from her waist. She waited for the disgust. Instead, Lucien's grip tightened, his fingers biting into the silk of her gown. He didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his body an impenetrable wall between her and the prying eyes of the council. "You're trembling, Seraphina," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that rattled her teeth. "Lucien, there is something you should know. About the timing. About Adrian." He silenced her by catching her chin, forcing her to look into eyes that were no longer amber, but a burning molten gold. "I know whose it is," he growled, the sound vibrating with a possessive ferocity that made the nearby nobles stagger back. In a move that shattered every rule of royal decorum, Lucien tilted her head back, exposing the pale column of her throat. Before the entire court, he buried his face in the crook of her neck. He didn't kiss her. He took a deep, dragging breath, rubbing his jaw against her skin in a deliberate, primitive display of scent marking. The room went deathly silent. It was an ancient declaration. He wasn't just claiming a wife. He was claiming the life inside her. "It is mine," Lucien whispered against her skin, his voice carrying through the hall like a decree. "Every breath you take and every beat of that heart. If anyone speaks of timing again, I will burn their houses to the ground." Seraphina's knees buckled, not from fear, but from the sudden terrifying realization that the king didn't just want her throne. He wanted her soul, and he was willing to lie to the world to keep it. The sky over the Black Palace didn't just break, it shattered. Lightning clawed at the obsidian spires, and the wind howled through the stone corridors like a wounded beast. Inside the royal suite, the fire in the hearth was the only thing standing between the opulent room and the encroaching shadows. Seraphina stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The scent marking from the ballroom still burned on her neck, a phantom heat that refused to fade. She was intensely aware of Lucien behind her. He had shed his formal coat, his white linen shirt unlaced at the throat, revealing the hard, corded muscle of a man built for conquest. "You should be resting," Lucien said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the thunder. "I can't," Seraphina whispered, turning to face him. "The things you said. The claim you made. Why would you tether your legacy to a child that isn't yours? To a woman who was dumped at an altar?" Lucien stepped into the circle of firelight, his amber eyes tracking the movement of her throat as she swallowed. "I told you once, Seraphina. I am never humiliated. And I don't make claims I don't intend to keep." He was close now, close enough that she could smell the cedar and the storm clinging to his skin. The fake marriage, the political optics, the carefully constructed distance. It all felt like thin glass ready to crack. Seraphina reached out, her fingers brushing the pulse point at his wrist. It was erratic, heavy, and undeniably hers. "Is this still the performance?" she asked, her voice a fractured thread. Lucien's hand snapped out, his fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of her neck, tilting her head back until she was forced to meet his molten gaze. "There are no witnesses here, Seraphina. No counsel. No cameras. Only us." He leaned in, his breath warm against her lips. "I have spent weeks pretending I don't want to tear the world apart just to see you smile. I have spent years watching you from the periphery, waiting for that fool to realize what he had so I could steal it." The admission hit her harder than the thunder. Before she could process the weight of his words, his mouth was on hers. It wasn't the polite kiss of a contract, it was a collision. It tasted of desperation and salt and a hunger that had been suppressed for too long. Seraphina's hands found the damp linen of his shirt, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. The physical alpha pull she had fought for months finally snapped, dragging her under. When he lifted her, her silk gown rustling against his skin, the storm outside ceased to matter. In the heat of the firelight, the contract was burned to ash, replaced by a raw, primitive need that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the man who had finally made her feel like a queen. The morning after the storm brought a deceptive tranquility to the Black Palace, but by noon, the air in the queen's solar had curdled. Seraphina sat at her writing desk, her hand instinctively resting over the slight, hidden curve of her stomach. The memory of Lucien's touch was still a warm weight in her soul, yet the sharp rap at her door signaled the arrival of a different kind of fire. "Your Majesty," her lady-in-waiting whispered, her face as pale as the parchment she held. "The High Council has been summoned. Anonymous missives were delivered to every minister an hour ago. They speak of the timing of your quickening." Seraphina's heart went cold. Elena. The mistress wasn't content with Adrian's pathetic devotion. She wanted Seraphina's crown as a trophy. By the time Seraphina reached the council chamber, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper and fresh scandal. At the far end of the long mahogany table sat Elena, looking radiant in a gown of shimmering gold, her eyes bright with the feverish light of a woman who believed she had finally found the killing blow. Adrian stood behind her, looking miserable yet tethered to her side like a dog. "The king's lineage is sacred," the High Chancellor announced, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "A claim has been made that the child the queen carries is not of Draven blood, but a Blackmoor stray. If this is true, the marriage is a fraud, and the queen must be stripped of her titles." Elena stepped forward, her smile a thin, venomous line. "I only wish for the truth to be known. Adrian and Seraphina were together mere weeks before the wedding. It is a simple calculation of biology, is it not?" Seraphina felt the eyes of the council boring into her. Predatory, judgmental, waiting for her to break. She looked at Adrian, who averted his gaze, and then at Elena, whose triumph was premature. "You speak of biology as if you understand power." A voice rumbled from the shadows behind the throne. Lucien emerged, his presence so sudden and absolute that the councilmen scrambled to their feet. He didn't look at the ministers. He walked straight to Seraphina, his hand sliding around her waist to pull her flesh against his side. The predatory amber in his eyes had turned into a flat, lethal gold. "The child is mine," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying silk that made the glass carafes on the table rattle. I have marked her. I have claimed her. If any among you values your head, you will not question my scent or my word again." He turned his gaze toward Elena, and the woman's smug expression shattered into pure, unadulterated terror. As for you, Lucien moved with a speed that made the air whistle. He didn't touch her, but he leaned into her space until she stumbled back against Adrian. "You have mistaken my mercy for weakness. You thought to poison my queen's name? You have only succeeded in signing your own exile." He turned back to Seraphina, his thumb tracing the mark on her neck in a public display of possession that silenced the room. The gamble had been made, but as Lucien's eyes met hers, Seraphina realized the true battle was just beginning. The wrath of a king is rarely a sudden explosion. It is a cold, calculated starvation. By the following morning, the Blackmore family legacy began to bleed. While Seraphina sat in the sun-drenched conservatory, the air still thick with the scent of Lucien's possessive marking, the machinery of the Draven Empire was already grinding Adrian's world to dust. Lucien didn't stay to comfort her with soft words. He was a creature of action, pacing the war room with a lethal rhythmic grace that made his generals pull their collars. He had discovered the depth of Elena's plot, how she had bribed a palace maid to track Seraphina's cycles, and how Adrian had stood by, silent and complicit, hoping to shackle Seraphina to his own failure. They thought to use her vulnerability as a weapon, Lucien rumbled, his voice a low tectonic growl that vibrated through the stone floor. "They will learn that everything they own exists only by my sufferance." By noon, the Blackmore shipping permits were revoked. By dusk, the royal banks called in every debt Adrian's father had accrued over 3 decades. The systematic dismantling was surgical. Lucien didn't just strip them of their influence, he erased their future. He sat at his mahogany desk, signing the orders that would seize the Blackmore estates, his amber eyes burning with a dark, satisfied hunger. When Seraphina finally found him, the room was cast in the deep crimson of a dying sunset. She watched from the doorway as he threw a final ledger onto the fire. He looked up, his predatory gaze softening only when it landed on her. The dominance he had radiated all day didn't vanish. It simply redirected, becoming a protective wall that stood between her and the world. "Lucien," she whispered, stepping into the heat of the room, "the court is saying the Blackmores are ruined. Adrian is begging for an audience." Lucien rose, crossing the distance between them in 3 long silent strides. He reached out, his large hand cupping her cheek, his thumb dragging across her lower lip with a pressure that was both a caress and a command. "Let him beg," Lucien murmured, his voice dropping to a possessive silk. He had a jewel and he treated it like glass. Now he will watch from the gutter while I deck that jewel in gold. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his scent of cedar and cold iron enveloping her. "I am not just protecting a queen, Seraphina. I am making sure that no man ever dares to think you are reachable again. You are mine, and what is mine is untouchable." Seraphina shivered, not from cold, but from the intoxicating, terrifying realization that Lucien's love was a beautiful cage, and after a lifetime of being discarded, she never wanted to leave. The victory gala was a shimmering display of Draven opulence, but for Seraphina, the air inside the ballroom felt heavy with the scent of lilies and judgment. Seeking a moment of clarity, she slipped out onto the moonlit terrace, the silk of her midnight blue gown whispering against the stone. The garden was a labyrinth of silvered leaves and deep shadows, a place where the music of the violins reached her only as a haunting, distant echo. She hadn't gone 20 paces before a figure emerged from the gloom of a topiary arch. It was Adrian. He looked broken, his once pristine doublet stained and his eyes rimmed with the red of exhaustion. The systematic ruin Lucien had visited upon his house had stripped away his arrogance, leaving behind a desperate, hollow man. "Seraphina," he choked out, reaching for her hand with trembling fingers. "Please. I was a fool. Elena." She was a fever, a madness. "But I see now that you are the only one who can save me. Tell Lucien to stop. Tell him you're coming home with me." Seraphina stepped back, her pulse spiking, but for the first time it wasn't from fear. It was from a cold, crystalline clarity. She looked at the man she had once thought was her entire future, and felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. "Home?" she asked, her voice steady and sharp as a diamond. "You didn't want a home, Adrian. You wanted a trophy to neglect." You threw me to the wolves at the altar because you thought I was too weak to survive the bite. I love you," he cried, his voice cracking with a pathetic high-pitched desperation. "I made a mistake, but we were meant to be." A low, predatory growl vibrated through the air, and Seraphina looked up. Lucien was standing on the balcony above, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the glowing palace windows. He wasn't interfering. He stood with his arms crossed, his amber eyes burning through the dark, watching her with a terrifying silent intensity. He was giving her the choice he had promised, the chance to choose her own cage or her own throne. Seraphina turned back to Adrian, drawing herself up until the Draven diamonds at her throat caught the moonlight. "You don't love me, Adrian. You love the safety I represented," she said, her voice carrying through the garden with a newfound regal authority. "I am no longer the girl you dumped at the altar. I am the queen of this realm, and I am the wife of a man who actually knows my worth." She leaned in, her eyes cold. "If you ever touch me again, I won't need the king to destroy you. I'll do it myself. Now get out of my sight." Adrian crumpled, the finality of her rejection hitting him harder than any royal decree. As he slunk away into the shadows, Seraphina looked back up at the balcony. Lucien was already moving, descending the stone stairs with a lethal fluid grace. When he reached her, he didn't speak. He simply pulled her into the heat of his chest, his hand cupping the back of her head as if to shield her from the very memory of the man who had just left. "You chose," Lucien murmured against her hair, his voice thick with a dark, triumphant pride. "I chose," she whispered, leaning into his strength. "I chose the king." The nursery of the Black Palace was bathed in the amber glow of a setting sun, the air smelling of fresh lavender and the faint, underlying scent of cedar that always followed the king. Seraphina stood by the hand-carved ebony crib, her hand resting over the prominent swell of her stomach. The child within kicked, a strong, insistent reminder of the life they were building. A heavy warmth enveloped her from behind as Lucien stepped into her space. He didn't say a word, simply wrapping his massive arms around her waist and resting his chin in the crook of her neck. His heartbeat was a slow, rhythmic drum against her back, steadying the frantic pace of her own. "You're thinking of that day again," Lucien murmured, his voice a low vibration that thrummed through her spine. "The day the world thought I was merely being charitable." Seraphina turned in his arms, her fingers tangling in the dark silk of his shirt. "You saved me from a nightmare, Lucien. But sometimes I wonder, how did you move so fast? How were you so ready to take a bride who had just been discarded?" Lucien's gaze darkened, the amber in his eyes swirling with a raw, ancient intensity. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip with a possessive heat. "I didn't move fast, Seraphina. I moved exactly when the trap I set finally snapped shut." She froze, her breath hitching. "What do you mean?" "I have watched you since you were a girl of 18 at your first debut," he confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate silk. "I watched Adrian neglect you, squander you, and chase after a woman who was nothing but a shadow compared to your light. I didn't just happen to be at that wedding. I made sure Elena felt bold enough to show up. I ensured Adrian's debts were heavy enough that he would crack under the pressure of a scandal." Seraphina stared at him, the realization washing over her like a tide. The convenience of their marriage, the suddenness of his intervention. It hadn't been a lucky break. It had been a conquest years in the making. "You orchestrated my humiliation?" she whispered, though she found she couldn't pull away. "I orchestrated your freedom," Lucien corrected, his grip tightening as he pulled her flesh against his chest. "I knew he would never deserve you. I waited for him to fail so I could finally claim what has belonged to me in my heart for years. I didn't want a treaty, Seraphina. I wanted you." The darkness of his obsession should have terrified her, but as she looked into his eyes, she saw only an unwavering, fierce devotion. He had burned down her old life to build her a throne. "And the child?" she asked softly. Lucien leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a promise that tasted of forever. "The child is a Draven, born of your spirit and protected by my blood. We are no longer a contract, my queen. We are a dynasty." As the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, Seraphina leaned into the king who had moved mountains and crushed men, just to hold her hand. The betrayal at the altar was a distant ghost. In the heart of the Black Palace, they were finally truly united.